I have a question for you, Mr. Davies, if I could. Could you talk a little bit about sort of more with a little more specificity about what comes next in moving forward your project? How would you like to see this sort of unfold in the best case as you try to move this product into sort of general or some use and distribution?
There's a lot of different answers to that question. In short, really we're looking for those scenarios that are already implementing some sort of electronic interface for either marking a ballot or some of the UOCAVA blank ballot delivery systems that we can simply essentially hand over the assets, the work we've done on interaction design and plain language work, and have that resource be able to be sort of put as a layer on top of what's going on already. So as I mentioned, our best test beds are jurisdictions that already have some sort of electronic ballot interface in place. So a great example of that is the state of Oregon. They're all vote by mail, but for their UOCAVA voters, they have an HTML ballot right now that exists with a user interface that people go through screens and make choices. And right now they print out code at the end of that process and mail it back into the state. This is an exact interface that could be put in place of the interface that's there now. Have those same UOCAVA voters go through the process, only with a much easier interface, and then submit that same print code, mail back to state to submit their ballot format. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you. I think that concludes the panel. Oh, Mark, did you have
If I could,
further?
I'd like to comment on something Commissioner Patrick mentioned about the wait times and the sensitivity to adding a minute or so to voting time. And that was something that I was very surprised at, how sensitive the wait times are to things like that. And if you do play around with it, you know, small changes here and there can take a 15-minute wait time, maximum wait time, and suddenly you wind up with an hour and a half. The sensitivity to ballot length, I think probably we could use more research on the time added for ballot initiatives and things like that. The best estimates I got were from Ted Allen at Ohio, and I have to credit him with this, but I also blame me if the numbers aren't exactly accurate, because I kind of pushed him into giving me some ballpark figures, you know, from some more thorough research he had done. But just kind of a rough estimate of time it takes to vote. I think the ballpark he came up with was around something like 30 seconds plus 4 or 5 seconds per race, plus about 25 to 30 seconds per referendum or initiative. And we actually used that little calculation a couple times just to do a quick estimate, you know, absent actually trying it on people, and it was reasonably accurate. And if we get the data, if we can measure things like that, we can actually measure the cost of adding a referendum to a ballot, and in you know, how much additional equipment you need to avoid long lines and things like that.
Could I add to that? One thing that strikes me as you mention that is that I also wonder if that's equipment dependent on whether or not the voter is voting on a DRE, whether it's the full ballot screen, whether they navigate through screens as they work their way through the ballot, or if it's a paper ballot, and if it's a paper ballot, how many pages are on that ballot. So, and I think it would also be important to know whether or not there are limited English proficient voters in a particular area, which may increase your time to vote in a certain region, that sort of thing. The one thing that did strike me is, if I'm not mistaken, I think the amount of time it goes up to 10 minutes is all. So perhaps there are some places where it took longer.
I know. I heard the 30-minute quote from somebody in Florida, I think it was. Yeah. It is somewhat dependent on the equipment. There's been a lot of research on that, and it seems like the DREs may add anywhere from 45 seconds to a minute or minute and a half to overall voting time. Some of the research is a little bit conflicting there, but it does, in general, seem like that does add a little bit to it. The optical scan ballots seem to be, the paper ballots seem to be fastest by a bit, but the length of the ballot is by far the more important issue there. So, thank you.
Thank you very much to this panel. The work you're doing is really very, very interesting and has tremendous potential. But thank you very much for coming and presenting it here today. And we look forward to potentially exploring with you, having additional information from you as we proceed. Thank you.
That flight from Kansas City to Cincinnati apparently took Steve Milo's from us, and Darren Shaw has a family emergency, so we'd like to welcome Barry Burden and Steve Ansel Behair, sorry. Barry, would you care to begin?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Slides will be up in a moment. I am a native Ohioan, so great to be back. Thanks for bringing me back to my home state. Jeff and I were each counting on 8 minutes, and he's not here because of the flight problems, so I fully intend to take 16.
Fair enough.
Seriously, there is a lot of material, so I'm going to move fairly quickly, but feel free to ask questions afterwards. So I'm going to offer you what we know as academics about poll workers, the recruitment and training of poll workers. We know that they have the ability to facilitate participation and voter interest and voter confidence in the electoral process. And we know that those experiences may translate into future participation by voters, so they are really the face of the electoral system for most voters and can impact that experience. But the questions for us are, what are the best methods for recruiting, training, and also evaluating poll workers to produce these positive experiences? So some basic facts in terms of lay of the land. We don't exactly know how many poll workers there are in this country. Best estimate of a series of ballparks is about 1.5 million. That would mean in a presidential election, about 1 out of every 100 voters is a poll worker. They do a variety of things, according to surveys we have of both them and their local election officials, from checking in voters to being technicians. We talked about this in some of the discussion yesterday. We also know that they are disproportionately female, older, educated, selected by parties, which I'll say more about, and most are experienced. They're repeat poll workers. We also know that the states have a variety of rules about how poll workers are selected. Some of this has been documented in EAC reports. For example, 48 states have a minimum number of poll workers per polling place, ranging from 2 to 8 per poll. 47 states require the poll workers to be registered to vote. The other 3 do not. 40 require them to be 18 years old, and so on. Lots of variation. At the bottom there, you'll see some mention of pay. There is some variation there. I think it's not as great as that indicates, from $15 to $200 per day. Most poll workers are earning about $100 a day, but there is variation. The question for us is, what are the best practices? What ought states and localities be doing in terms of poll workers? We don't know, is the short answer. There really are not studies that do policy evaluations of this type. There aren't experimental studies to see what works and what doesn't in a real field setting. We have a list of best practices. The EAC document from 2007 or so runs well over 200 pages. So in my view, these are not best practices, they're just practices which work for some people and offer opportunities for learning, but we'd like to know which of these are most effective, both from a cost standpoint and in terms of improving the voting experience. Local election officials tell us in surveys they think training is important, and that about 1 out of every 5 poll workers appear to have problems in understanding the job they're doing in the polling place. As I say, we need evaluation studies to know which of these things is right. Poll worker attributes have some impact on how voters experience the voting process, and we know that experience is related to the confidence they have. In some analyses that Jeff has done that he could share with you, he finds that voters report having a worse experience at the polling place on Election Day if they don't know the poll worker personally, if the poll worker is over age 70, that's a 3 times effect, and if the poll worker has a minority background and the voter is white. Those things show up pretty robustly in multivariate analysis. Let's talk about poll worker shortages. A lot of discussion, a lot of media coverage of there not being enough poll workers and the difficulty of recruiting. And as a result, you get a lot of guidance from people testifying before your commission and from others about how to solve the shortage problem. Examples of solutions are that we ought to hire students, we ought to select more alternates for the no-shows, there ought to be holidays, there ought to be split shifts, and so on. But let's look at the evidence on shortages. Our best evidence is from the EAC surveys, the EAVS, which ask local election officials how much difficulty they had in obtaining sufficient poll workers. That's the language. It's a 5-point scale from very easy to obtain the right number to very difficult. And you'll see that the largest group is that they say they had somewhat difficult time finding sufficient poll workers. But that is not to say that they didn't find enough poll workers. It's that they had some difficulty in finding them. Right? The question is really, do you have enough? Not did it require some effort to do? Why might we doubt the answers to these questions? One is that it being difficult is not the same as there being a shortage. Another is that in the surveys you're going to hear about from Steve in a moment, when we ask local election officials what worked best in the 2012 election, a series of 21 items they could select from, the number one thing that worked best, in the preliminary data at least, is they had plenty of availability of poll workers. The number 4 thing on this list of 21 that they rated was the training and management of those poll workers went well. What things are they most concerned about from the same survey, again the same 21 items? The availability of poll workers. Number 5, training and management of poll workers. So this may be a story that's not uniform across the states. One other reason to be skeptical, I just pulled out some example states that are at either end of the continuum. So on the left are the states where they say it was easiest to find poll workers. Not a single jurisdiction in those states in 2012 said that it was somewhat or very difficult. DC, Michigan, Minnesota, easy states. On the right, you have the states where every jurisdiction in the state reported that it was somewhat or very difficult to find poll workers. Based on what we know about election administration performance in those states, it doesn't line up nicely with our, at least, stereotypes about which states run elections well and not well. Does it relate to other factors? Sort of. So as the difficulty becomes greater, you see that there are more registered voters in jurisdictions. So I think this fits with other evidence we've seen that it's harder to find poll workers in urban or more populated places, places with more population density. But in terms of the other metrics, there aren't big differences. In the second column, you'll see the percentage of votes that are cast on Election Day versus being cast in advance. It's about 75% cast on Election Day for the upper categories, and things have gone black. In the most difficult category, it's slightly higher, so it looks as though there's more pressure on those communities that have more Election Day voting, as would make sense. We really do need to see the pictures for the next slide.
Yeah, well, we have somebody looking into it right now.
There go your 16 minutes.
Minutes are ticking away. Okay, let's look at some metrics from the states on how poll workers are deployed. This will be a little tough to see given the size of the screen. This is from the EAVS. It's the number of poll workers per polling place in the last 2 federal elections. Number of poll workers per polling place. This is the median number in the state. The typical number in a state is about 5 or 6 poll workers per polling place. But you'll see tremendous variation from the lowest states with just 2 or 3 poll workers at a polling place to the highest with 10 or 12 or 14, and a ratio of 2 or 3 times from the least to the most. They are consistent over time, so the states that have high numbers in one election have high numbers in the next. but tremendous variation across the states. Again, not in ways that sync up with our stereotypes about which states run elections well or not well. The same is true of voters per poll worker. So how many voters is each poll worker responsible for? Again, from the EAVS. Tremendous variation, with the average being about 100 voters per poll worker. But from the lowest states to the highest, a ratio of about 4 to 1. So tremendous variation. Connecticut's something of an outlier, but even if you remove them, actually the variation would look greater if we zoomed in on the scale a little bit. And then finally, from other evidence, we have ratings of poll workers by voters. This is the percentage who say their poll worker was, I think, excellent. And you'll see that most are very satisfied with probably 80% on average, rating poll workers quite well. There's some variation, and that seems to have to do with whether the state is rural or urban. So the states with the highest rankings in 2012 are places like Alaska and Idaho and Maine. And states with the lower rankings are places like DC and New York. Finally, let's put all of the measures, the ones I've just showed you and some others, into one comparison. Again, going to be difficult to see on the screen, but hopefully available in your packets. These are just scatter plots of the measures I've shown you, along with some others like wait times, the amount of in-person voting that happens, the amount of early voting that happens. And you'll see that the metrics I just showed you, poll workers per polling place, voters per polling place, difficulty of obtaining poll workers, are uncorrelated with any of the other measures, uncorrelated with wait times, uncorrelated with voter satisfaction, and so on. And even if there were correlations, we would be concerned about what's causing what. Okay? Now, maybe states are the wrong place to look. Maybe the interesting variation is really at the local level or even down to the precinct level. But at the state level, it appears that recruitment methods and deployment don't have much connection to how voters experience Election Day. Another concern we hear is that low pay is a problem, that poll workers aren't compensated adequately for their time. I would say we don't know if that's the case. Surveys, in fact, show when you ask poll workers, this is in one California study, what are the things that made you want to be a poll worker? Most of them say pay was the last thing on the list. Right? It wasn't about the $100, it was about the civic duty, and it was about seeing their friends. It was a social activity. Right? So even local election officials rate pay as less of a problem for them, less of a priority than training of poll workers, evaluating them, and recruiting them. So let me raise a couple more considerations before I close, things that we don't tend to talk about as much compared to recruitment and pay. One is the fact that we select poll workers primarily by political party. It's the most common method for selecting poll workers. We see that in surveys of local election officials. Local election officials tell us they don't do much screening of poll workers who are nominated to them, selected by the parties. The only concern they face typically is that there's an imbalance, that one party in the area is good at nominating poll workers and the other, because it's not organized or not strong there, has difficulty doing it. So they have trouble finding enough poll workers on one side of the ledger. But that's the only concern we hear. I suspect, and this is without much evidence, that selection by parties is something of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it means that you're likely to get poll workers more easily because the parties are doing the work for you. They are likely to be engaged and pretty informed and experienced. They have done this before and so need less training. But you might sacrifice other things in exchange for those goodies. They may be less objective. They work for a party, after all. That's their interest in politics. And we don't know much about their competence. We know that they're loyal partisans and are willing to do this. We don't know much about their skill sets. Which means we have to put some emphasis on training. So I want to say a few things from surveys that David Kimball and his collaborators have done of local election officials and poll workers. First of all, training is not always required, especially of repeat poll workers. Just startling fact, training not always required. When training happens, there are topics that are commonly covered, things like the procedures at the polling place. 84% of jurisdictions tell us they cover those things. How to use the voting equipment, only 2/3 of jurisdictions tell us that's part of the training. So 1/3 are not covering how to use the voting equipment in training. And only about half are covering how to deal with provisional ballots in the training of poll workers. Right, so we have to think about the content of training. Only about half are doing what we would call role playing. This is actively pretending to run through a scenario at a polling station. And yet poll workers tell us that's one of the most valuable things they can do, is to practice what they'll see on election day. There are very few standards, and there are really no widespread methods for evaluating poll workers after the fact. Local election officials tend to move on to the next piece of business after the election. So a few conclusions. One is that I hope the Commission, in moving forward, will think about quality as well as quantity of poll workers as things to emphasize. Quantity has been emphasized because it's easy to measure. We can simply count up how many there are or ask election officials, how many do you have? Do you have enough? Is it more or less than last time? Quality is going to be more difficult to assess because it has multiple pieces. It has to do with the recruitment on the front end. Where do we get the poll workers? How many are there? It has to do with the training once we've selected them, and then it has to do with evaluating them after the election. I mentioned the EAC best practices. It's a lot of practices. Some of them relate to recruitment, training, and evaluation, so we should look back at those. But we really lack clear evidence on what works, and that's in part because we haven't done the field work, the policy analysis, and the experiments we would like. Thank you.
Thank you. I should add that Barry, who is with the University of Wisconsin, and his colleague Jeff Milo from the University of Missouri have prepared a very helpful paper for us on the recruitment and training of poll workers, which is available on the Commission's website at supportthevoter.gov, and we urge you to take a look at that for additional insights into this important subject. Next, Steve, along with his colleague Darren Shaw, have prepared a survey and gotten some initial results on a survey of election administrators, which the Commission looks forward to hearing about, and we know it's going to be helpful. Steve?
Thank you for having me today. And I'm going to talk about the survey. I'm going to emphasize a part of the survey, not the entire thing, and I'll explain where we're going in a second. This is a survey of election administrators that I and Darren Shaw and Charles Stewart and others designed. Barry helped, and most of the people involved in the group that we've assembled, Don Inbody helped, and we used the survey for multiple purposes. One idea, though, was to try to fill in some gaps. The EAC's survey is excellent. It covers a lot of domains that we're interested in, but some pieces of information we're missing, and we're trying to use the survey to fill in those. For example, how do you split the UOCAVA ballots into military overseas versus military domestic, and so forth. So some of the information we'll see will come from that. The data behind this are still coming in, and I'm going to give you a preliminary picture of that. Let me talk a little bit about the basics of the design of the survey for starters. So the survey design was pretty straightforward as these things go. The goal was to just survey every election administrator in the United States. We started off thinking we would do a sample, but then we just decided to do everybody and see what happened. And we broke it into two surveys, a short survey that was designed to capture things like, how's your office structured? How much money do you have? What's your budget? What's your staff? And so forth. That was about 5 minutes long. Once that was done, we said, if you'd like to go on, please do. So far, from the preliminary data, 3/4 decided to go on and fill out a half-hour survey. So they were pretty engaged in this survey, I think. The questionnaire design was developed by this group, and the survey was implemented by an organization called Census Research. We selected Census after we went out for a competitive bid. They were both promised and had a record of producing a high-quality product, and they came in far cheaper. The data and the reports will be available through the Caltech Voting Technology Project website and will be available fully to you. I'm going to talk a lot about the open-ended questions today because I think they're fascinating. Rather than put a bunch of numbers before you that you won't be fully able to digest, they reveal some things and underscore some lessons that I think we should keep in mind. There were two aspects of this survey, as I mentioned. One is to measure the operations and the decision-making of the offices. How do you actually allocate poll workers? How do you actually allocate machines? How much money do you have? Things that we don't really have a clear picture of from other data sets, such as the EAC's surveys or Charles Stewart's SPAE survey. The second was to hear from the election administrators themselves in their own words about what's happening, what are they doing, where do they think their office is headed, where do they see needs. And I'm going to focus on number 2 today. The white paper will delve into both. The data we're going to present today are very preliminary. Right now, we look like we're on target for at least a 40% response rate, which is terrific. And that response rate, I think, owes a lot in part to the help that we receive from a number of election officials helping recruit their friends and colleagues to participate, help from the Election Center, from IAC, RIAT, and other organizations. And we're very grateful to all the effort that went into that. It was a lot of work. People put themselves out there, and it was most appreciated. I'm in particular going to focus on one of the questions. There are 3 questions that we really went after to dig into this matter of what's going on in the election offices and what the election officers see. One, we just asked, what are the problems that you've had, what's worked well, what hasn't worked well, what have been the specific challenges. Second question, which I'm going to talk most about today, is are there technologies or new administrative procedures that you would like to try even if you can't afford them? So where do you want to go? And then the third question is, were there things that you did that you'd like to share with other offices? Tell us what they are. Let's put them out there. So we're going to make all that available to you so you can hear what sorts of things people are coming up with. There's more coherence to this second question, so we'll talk a bit about that. But just to give you a sense of what happened on the question with problems, there was, I think, a theme that came out, which is repeatedly we heard 3 things were big problems. How do I handle absentees? How do I handle UOCAVAs? And how do I handle early voting? What's distinctive about those 3 things is they've really grown up in the past decade. And my read on what people are saying is going on, that the election administrator is saying is going on, is we have this system that changed really quickly over the last decade. And it grew up from this unified system in which the precinct was the central part of the model, and then it kind of expanded into this complicated 3 or 4-part system, and the system hasn't quite grown back together yet. And they're looking for how to do that. And I think one thing to think about as a commission is how do we help guide that, or how does the commission help give some push in some directions that might help them think through this process. But they're in the middle of a process, and it's probably going to be another decade before it grows back together into something coherent where there's a central thing. And there's one quote you'll see in a bit that I really think is quite priceless in this regard. But let's turn to what administrators want to implement. Number 1, 2/3 of them said this. E-poll books. Here are the first, I'm not making this up, here are the first 10 responses to this open-ended question. First person, electronic poll books. Second person, in all capitals, we would like to have e-poll books. Third person, have electronic poll books, all voting locations with precinct workers with the ability to operate them. Fifth, electronic poll books. Sixth, okay, better voting technology. Seventh, e-poll books. Did we mention e-poll books? Electronic poll books. It goes on. Definitely electronic poll books. So I just took the first chunk off the top of the database. This is what they are all talking about. This is what they want. And over 2/3 of the open-ended responses that offered a response to this question of what would you like to have, even if you can't afford it, it was e-poll books. Okay? Number 2 was new voting technologies. And these quotes, I try to grab quotes that were typical of the answers. There's the last one is just, I had to put it on there, sorry. There's a sense that the voting equipment that they're using, even if it's just 10 years old, stuff that they bought in 2002 or 2003, it's already quite outmoded. And even if it's a DRE, that's operating on a pre-2002 operating system for an electronic machine. If I tried to run any software on my computer with a pre-2002 operating system, it would not work, right? And that's the experience that some of these election administrators are starting to experience. But I just love that last quote. Love to replace I won't put the brand name in there, machines, which I believe are a boat anchor. So, number 3 big issue was office technology. Now, one thing I should say about the survey, which is just a characteristic of election administration in the United States, is that there are, 300 election offices in the United States that are in big counties, big staff, a lot of resources. There are 8,000 election offices that are towns, small counties, and mid-sized counties. And most of that count, if we added them up, a large chunk of them would be towns. So there's a lot of these are very small offices. So some of these responses reflect the experience of small offices. And oftentimes when we have this kind of conversation in a meeting like this, we tend to focus on the 300 largest counties. Their problems, their experiences are very different from almost all other election offices. And comments like this were scattered throughout the open-ended. At this point, new computers would be a vast improvement. We have state-owned Dells from 2002. Yes, we are a relier. I would like to get a few of my election inspectors trained to be able to use the new SVRS along with me. This would require a computer and many hours of training. I would love to have more computers at our service counter. I would like to have internet access at the town hall. If we start to think about things like internet voting, these are the practicalities that are going to confront the implementation of these systems immediately. Fourth, resources. You've heard a lot about resources. It was striking that resources did not show up that much, but a lot of people did volunteer, even though the question said, even if you can't afford it, we just need more resources. Like, we just don't have the money. The third one was a little sad from my perspective. No, not really. Do you need any new technology? No, not really. I'm doing good if I get what I need. I've been in need of a telephone for my office, as well as a computer monitor and a printer and a scanner for some time. So these are these comments like this showed up repeatedly in the open-ended questions. So I just want to underscore the resource limitation, especially among the town administrators. Less so among the mid-sized counties. A lot of small counties and the towns are saying this repeatedly. And we rely on them. It's not a huge percentage of the voters, but it's a huge percentage of the offices that deal with election administration. Consolidation, putting this under one broad category, but there are a lot of comments to that effect. I would like to move toward vote centers. Vote centers showed up repeatedly. It's being experimented with in Colorado, Indiana, and other places. But there are also others who see the need for some sort of consolidated voting place. And the last comment here is quite revealing. The comment is, the precinct is outmoded because of redistricting creates ghost precincts, extremely small population-sized precincts. Voters don't relate to the neighborhood precinct anymore. Voters appear more interested in voting sites related to well-traveled areas. Right? So this idea that even in the election administrator's mind, there's a realization that the precinct is kind of this concept that's under strain. And that was the old concept back in the 70s and 80s, and it starts falling apart as absentee voting starts taking off. And absentee voting really took off in the 2000s and early voting, and it's really kind of causing us to rethink things. And that's an opportunity for consolidation. The sixth thing was integration. I think these quotes come from the most sophisticated election offices, and we see them every once in a while. Some people write a nice solid paragraph on how they see all the technology pieces integrated together. So even the most sophisticated offices have all these bits of technology that just don't talk to each other. They're not related to each other. They're not integrated. They don't play together. Can't use them in a coherent whole. But the election officers see it sure would be good if we could make all the pieces work together. And there's some excellent ideas, thoughts in the open-ended questionnaire. It was striking going through this how little emphasis there was on voter education. And I say this in response to one of the closed-ended questions that I'll be interested in seeing how it comes out in the end. But from the preliminary data we had, which reflects about 30% of the respondents that we have so far, we have much more data than we've been able to analyze yet. Only about 20% of the election offices said that they actually sent something to the voters pertaining to voter education. Most of them rely on the states, in states that have voter pamphlets and don't do anything more than that. Right? So there's not a lot of action from the election offices to communicate to the voters about how to vote, where to vote, et cetera, for most of the offices. Now, it's not maybe most of the voters, because that's going to depend on big counties versus small counties, but a lot of the offices just are not engaged in doing basic things that we consider voter education, and it doesn't show up as one of the practices or technologies that they would like to implement or they're thinking about implementing. So it probably reflects the fact that maybe the conversation about voter education isn't really happening as deeply or as widely in the election administration community as maybe it ought. One of the other questions we asked that I am quite fond of is, have you implemented any innovations that you would think would help other jurisdictions like yours, and could you briefly describe them? These were all over the map, and they ranged from little tiny details like, oh, I color code everything so that it's very easy to find it quickly. Like, everybody should color code things. Or I use Post-it notes all over. It's really specific things that are helpful, all the way up to, we need to train the election office to have better management skills. I think the management skills are missing. So we've got down to, from micro up to macro management. You've got the range of technologies from little things that they do to optimize things all the way up to we integrated the entire system with the DMV, is the case of Delaware, and really saying that that's a model for other states to pursue. So this particular question, I think, could be quite helpful, just sifting through and reading through the Excel spreadsheet, like look at all these different ideas that we have to go through. One thing shows up repeat, wrong button, which is the most important thing that I think happens among the counties, is that they learn from each other. And these are volunteered answers to our question, what would you like to share with others? I don't want to share anything because I actually learn from others. Like, what I want to share is that our innovations come from other counties. There's a degree of learning that happens. Now, I think it happens in a very loose way, and one question I think for us is there some way that we can help the counties learn better? Some way to improve the way that they learn. And some of that might help with integration and so forth, but some of the comments were, this was from a town administrator, the county clerk gets us all together and we have a conversation after each election and before each election. It's a great idea. Things like that might be helpful, and just suggesting it might go a long way to helping to improve the extent to which the counties are learning from each other. A few lessons to take away. The main goal, I think, is to facilitate learning among the election offices. I think there's a good use to measuring activities and experiences like this. I learned a lot just reading through the commentary and also looking at some of the closed-ended results. Whoops. We can help local election administrators further their management skills. There might be a very constructive place and role for the Election Center, NACED, NACO, IACRIAT, and other organizations. And I think finally there needs to be a locus, some website that's centrally maintained that election officers can share successful innovations, cautionary tales, and other insights in a kind of open, unabashed manner where they're not advocating for a system. They're just putting out there what they've learned in a way that others can use it. And I look forward to your comments, but finally, thank you. Thank you for all the work you've done. I know you guys have had a long march to this point through the different meetings and deliberations you've had, and everyone in America, I think, appreciates what you're doing. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. Questions from the commissioners? Commissioner Lomax?
Barry, when you look at the polling, there's a lot of huge differences between the states and the way they use polling places, for instance, where some assign one precinct to one polling place and it's a one-to-one relationship, and then like in Nevada, some polling places had one precinct, some had 6. And so then looking at, for instance, the number of workers per polling place, it's going to vary enormously just depending on how many precincts are there. But I guess perhaps that's solved by your slide that says number of workers per voter. Maybe it averages out that way. Did the one thing I noticed, I mean, you gave us a lot of kind of summaries of what you observed without giving us any recommendations. recently, we had a discussion with some people, and we were talking about testing poll workers. And I was very surprised to hear a pretty strong opinion in the room that it really doesn't pay to test them because we're not going to fire them regardless. Everybody's going to the poll, even if they can just sit there and look like they might be able to do the job, which of course is, I don't buy that, but they did. Your comments on any of that?
Yeah, so the first point is about combined polling places. You know, it's true that measuring poll workers per polling place is not ideal because some states aren't really using polling places. They're doing all mail or largely mail elections. Try to account for that in some ways by setting Oregon and Washington aside or correlating it with early voting. But, you know, it's true that states combine polling places or precincts into one location and have poll workers share the duties. I haven't dealt with that at all. We should. It would be difficult to get that information at that level of aggregation and combine it with the EAVS, for example. Those just come from different places, but maybe within some states we could do that kind of analysis.
You could do polling places per precinct, however. There's an economy of scale, for instance, if you send 6 polling places or precincts to one polling place. So you don't need quite as many workers is the way it works out. But I mean, it ranged in where I was from 8,000 voters going to one polling place, you know, to 80 somewhere else.
Yeah, it's fair. And your other point is about testing. I'm not sure if the testing would happen before Election Day when the poll workers are being selected, or it would happen after as a kind of evaluation.
Oh, I'm talking about you do training, and I'm just going to use what we did. I mean, you do training, and then we put them through what we call a performance evaluation. They had to do what they would do at the polling place. And we did not train poll workers to be universal in a polling place. In other words, they were trained to be a clerk, which check in a voter. We trained them to be a machine operator. We called it. They would stand behind the machine and help the voter if they had any questions. We trained the dumbest one to hand out I voted stickers at the end of the day. But everybody had something specifically to do. And but then we did test them in the sense that we would act it out, as you said, a performance evaluation. And we actually got rid of about 15 to 20% of them, that high.
So they say there are no small parts, only small actors. So even the voting sticker person's important. So we know from surveys of local election officials what they do roughly in terms of evaluating or screening. Most are not as thorough or systematic as you were. They tell us that they sort of casually observe the poll workers they recruit during the training period. And if something seems like it's not working at that point, they may ask the person to leave. After the fact, most of the evaluations following the election are of the form, did they observe the poll worker doing something crazy at the polling place, or did they get complaints from voters about a particular poll worker over and over, and those people might be asked to go. But otherwise, I think it's who is sent to them by the parties or who volunteers or who they recruit end up being the poll workers, almost regardless. So the testing is not happening in any systematic way as far as I can tell.
We were fortunate for what it's worth. The parties were not involved in selected poll workers, so that we didn't have to put up with that. Thank you.
This is a question for Professor Burden. In the training, did you have any information as it relates to, as Commissioner Lomax referred, where they were trained by position that they were going to be working, or a separation of first-time workers? I know some states also have an advanced training, like a certification for their poll workers. Did you capture any data on that? Or the one thing that I'm also very curious about are bilingual poll workers, and whether or not there are specific areas of training there, or exactly if you looked into any of those individual areas.
There are areas we should be looking at. The data don't exist in terms of what local election officials tell us. We know what the state law indicates in terms of minimum requirements. We don't know if local officials are obeying those laws or going beyond them. Most states require training of every new poll worker, but not necessarily of repeat poll workers. And sometimes a chief poll worker will receive extra training. Beyond that, we don't know much about languages or specific positions within the polling place or anything like that.
One of the things that we've heard from many groups over the course of the summer have to do with some of the curriculum outside of just the function of the poll worker on Election Day, whether it's sensitivity to voters with disabilities or how to effectively provide language assistance, that sort of thing. And many jurisdictions put that information, their training materials up on their websites. So I'm thinking that might be something that would be an interesting place to harvest and see what is even in some of these curricula, and if it's something that could be expanded upon.
Yeah, it's a great suggestion. I've looked at some of those online videos and manuals and things. So those set a kind of floor for what we know is happening, assuming those are being shown and viewed. We don't know what's happening beyond them. And the role-playing kinds of activities I mentioned, which are not happening as much as we might want, have to happen outside the video context, right? You need to bring somebody into a room and have Chris Thomas walk through and pretend to be a voter and get that, what happens when a voter objects, what happens when a provisional ballot has to be issued. So I think it's one thing to watch a video about that, it's another to do it. But I agree, it's a good place to start.
We have such a video. It is not a theatrically compelling performance.
Commissioner Thomas.
Now, what my mother said. So our precinct inspectors, we love them dearly. I mean, they're valuable. They're, like you said, they're not there for the money. They're there to do the job. And then comes the time, and I hear this a lot from local clerks in Michigan, is the separation. And I wonder if you picked that up in any of the discussions. So when they've either reached a point in time where, they're having difficulties performing, or, just behavioral type things, this idea of saying, okay, now it's time for you to leave, you've been doing this for 10 years, it's just not working out any longer. That's a tough spot particularly in smaller towns, for these clerks to get into in terms of letting people go. I wonder if that reflected in anything you've run into.
I only have anecdotal evidence on that, probably the way you do, that sometimes a poll worker will be encouraged to step aside by being assigned to a different precinct than the one they worked at for many years, or with different people. And the purpose for them was to see their friends at the polling place. So if you take that away, it's now a discouragement. But other than those kind of informal nudges, I don't know what else is done.
Commissioner McGeehan.
Yes, Dr. Anselo, now I can't say it. I said it right in my mind. It didn't come out. I'll just say Steve. I'll say Steve. Based on the preliminary results, it looks like there may be some momentum for the states to take some of the burden off. I mean, I've seen some of the comments talking about, a robust statewide voter registration system, poll books, even statewide voting systems. Did you see any comment when HAVA first passed and the states were having to implement some of these activities that before had all been performed at a local level? Are you seeing any territorial kind of things that, we don't need the state in our business, or is it more all, a little consolidation here on certain things might be beneficial?
So from the open-ended questions, responses to questions, I was very surprised by how thoroughly the counties seem to be embracing the statewide registration lists. They were very happy to have them. Those that had managed to integrate them with their other systems were thrilled. Like, this is so great. It really sped things up, or it got rid of it reduced a lot of our costs, got rid of a bunch of staffing needs and so forth with the statewide registration systems. I think back in 2002, that was a big question mark, and it was hard for the states to really gear up that fast. I mean, they only had 4 years to do that, and it was pretty impressive that they managed to pull it off. So I was surprised by how much of an embrace there had been. But generally, if you look across all the things that HAVA did, like new voting technologies and statewide registration lists and so forth, the counties were really quite happy with it. And they were quite happy with the HAVA funding. That came up a bunch of times in the open-endeds too. Like, give us some more HAVA funding. That was good. Or the HAVA funding's running out, and I'm really worried. That was another comment that we saw several times. Like, I'm really worried how I'm going to afford the next wave because HAVA really helped me in the first wave. So I think there was a lot of good stuff that came out of HAVA for the the wave that we just went through, and now we're in this new world.
Professor Persley?
Steve, you mentioned Uokava ballots, absentee and early voting. Could you give a little more detail on the Uokava concerns that the jurisdictions are having, and what in particular, say, apart from the generic absentee ballot kinds of issues that they're dealing with that the locals are complaining about?
So with each of these, there was a sense that, I have this other system that I have to manage completely separately and differently. And it was as if they had to set up a whole separate election. Whenever they'd isolate one of these, a lot of the concerns or complaints were, this is a real hassle, it's not a lot of ballots, and I have to devote a whole staff person to it. Or this is a hassle. There were a lot of problems handling mail with the absentee and the Uokava. There were a lot of problems staffing offices with early. Those seem to be the mail handling, staffing were the two issues that I saw coming up when they expressed their concerns. Certainly something to probe more deeply, and it would be a way to, we've heard a couple of really excellent technology panels at this session, and I think that's one way to think about the role of technology is to help with this reintegration of the system. Where can we go forward?
Co-Chairman Bauer.
Yeah, Steve actually concluded with a comment that bears or answers the question I was about to ask, which is in this world that you've described where things seem very fragmented to them, there have been changes in the world, and they're being asked, again, with limited resources, to do various things, all seemingly simultaneously, some separate from the others. They seem to believe they have to be separately staffed. The question I was going to ask you was, well, in keeping with your view that somehow we have to assist them, they deserve help in pulling everything back together again, it did occur to me the most obvious answer would be enhanced and innovative use of technologies. Is there something else? You certainly tease into some of it by saying, well, there are better ways to do things, and therefore if we have adequate information sharing around best practices, that presumably should help the various election administrative units work together. But that's also a little bit of a catch or as catch can because of the multiplicity of jurisdictions and information transmission issues and whether in fact practices wind up being widely adopted, and also whether something's actually a best practice or just a better practice, or as Barry Burden said, just a practice, whereas technology seems to have a much more direct, immediate, dramatic impact and a permanent one on their ability to solve some of these problems. So I'd be curious in your thoughts on that.
So I think the greatest strains that we're seeing of these different systems are increasing the lower you go in, the less populous the jurisdiction. I think the bigger jurisdictions are handling these things reasonably well. So if you go to LA County, they've got so much staff that they can, kind of figure it out. But if you go down to, small town in rural Michigan, handling these three systems is kind of driving them nuts. Technology, in that case, technology might further aggravate the situation if we don't think through this. And I think the push for vote centers actually has a little bit of the flavor of we've got to change this system in some fundamental way where we consolidate and capture economies of scale here, because the town level administration in some of these states is not capable of capturing it. I think that's where the biggest tension is in these smaller counties and smaller municipalities. One of the things I also saw, I didn't put many of these quotes up, was please don't change any more laws. Please don't do anything. The state shouldn't pass any more laws. I have too many things to administer. It's gotten so complicated. There's so much paperwork. I just don't know if I can handle it anymore. So keeping that's a big caveat. And then, you've got the guys who don't have telephones and internet service. So how technology is going to filter down is a big question for those agencies, and I think ultimately there's going to be an enormous pressure to consolidate. That's my guess about where this system's going to go. There's going to be an enormous amount of resistance to that from the very towns and counties, but that's where the pressure is going to come from. And Indiana and Colorado are two examples with vote centers of how such consolidation happens.
If I can just follow up, though, wouldn't the adjustment to the extent that the introduction of new technologies is an aggravant, wouldn't that be, for the most part, more of a short-term issue? That is to say, as the technologies are introduced and election officials have to appreciate how to use it and begin to master it on an ongoing basis, there would be presumably some disruption, but that you'd expect benefits over the longer term.
so long as you can capture the economies of scale. If the local official has to be a technologist, you may not be able to hire someone with sufficient skill to stay in that job for much time. And one of the lessons I put in the slides that I distributed earlier, but I didn't show you, was simply in doing this study, we learned something very important. We received 2 lists from 2 different sources. Turned out the lists had a lot of discrepancies. About 50% of the names were different. And I dug a little further, and it turns out they were about 3 to 4 years difference. One was older than the other. That suggested to us that there's been about a 50% turnover in election administrators in a 3 to 4 year period. Right? So keeping those if you get a good technologist in there and they're doing well, are they going to stay in that job, or are they going to move up the county ladder? The administrative concerns that we heard about how, from Wendy in particular, about how technology can be really effectively deployed, but it really takes somebody to dig in and kind of grab the technology by the throat and try to make it behave. It really takes a lot of expertise, and that may be lacking in most of these really local jurisdictions.
If I may have one more follow-up and then a question for Professor Burden. Do we have any data on what's behind the sort of how to break down that turnover?
No, we'll have data on the extent to which the lists differ and so forth, and what the counties were and the jurisdictions were, and we'll take a look at that. And we'll be able to cross that then with what kind of experiences were reported by the counties now. One of the things that did show up repeatedly in some of the questions was, I'm not sure how to answer this question because I've only been on the job for 3 months, or I'm a new election administrator, I don't know how to answer this question. So it actually creates some incomplete data problems.
And Professor Burden, my question for you has to do with your comments about political party recruitment of poll workers. First of all, actually, one thing I wanted to ask you about, there was a peculiar statistic that you had which said that 84% of poll worker training includes training in polling place procedures. So the natural question is, what's in the 16%?
I don't know what local officials are thinking when they answer that question. Okay. I assume it's things like how to open the polling place at the beginning of the day, how to reconcile ballots at the end of the day, what to do with the ballots then in terms of chain of custody, how to sign off when new poll workers arrive. So it may be if there's specialization in terms of training that if one person is the sticker person, they don't need to know all of those things. Okay. So it's possible that's what's going on.
Fair enough. The question about political party, do you happen to know whether, and I'm not suggesting this is a good thing or a bad thing, it may actually be a complicating factor, whether in the jurisdictions where the political parties play a role in recruiting poll workers, whether the parties are actually conducting their own separate and independent poll worker trainings, which wouldn't necessarily improve matters. I'm just suggesting, maybe, as I said, but I'm just curious to know whether there's an additional layer of training that the parties themselves provide. I believe in some jurisdictions that's true. I wouldn't suggest it's an altogether transparent process. I doubt last cycle I would have invited Ben to attend any of our poll worker trainings.
I enjoyed the ones I went to.
But he was able to observe them in action. But do you have any information on that?
Nothing systematic. I have anecdotes that the parties are being more careful about who they select and preparing them. In some states, there are provisions that say local election officials have to consult the parties first for poll workers. If the parties don't supply them, then they can go get their own preferred poll workers. And in many places, the parties were saying, we don't want to be involved in this. We don't even know we're allowed to be involved. And so they were, in fact, not being selected by parties, even though the state law permitted it. But the parties have stepped up in many places and now have recognized they have the right of first refusal and are sending along names in a way they weren't before.
And do we think that activity is concentrated in what's called battleground states, that that's where the parties are most active in recruiting poll workers?
In the state I live in, Wisconsin, it's happening because they feel as though there's more at stake.
Thank you.
Barry, I'm afraid you're probably not going to say no, but your slides showed that recruiting poll workers is not at least acknowledged. Well, I mean, it showed there was a problem and it wasn't a problem, depending which question I guess you were answering. What's your opinion on that? Or do you have one?
So I think this came up in testimony earlier today, and it shows up in the surveys that David Kimball and his colleagues have done. Recruiting of poll workers is not a problem in rural areas, but it is in urban areas. So I think part of the reason you see it as #1 on the list both the good and the bad, as it really depends on the kind of environment you're in. So these large jurisdictions have the benefit of more staff and more technology and more expertise and more professionalism and less turnover, but they have real difficulty just in getting bodies to show up. So it may be that the solutions that you all want to look at in terms of best practices or recommendations really vary by the size of the jurisdiction. And I hope you're hearing that in other testimony, that just the solutions are not going to, even within a state, with one set of laws and culture, it's not going to be the same set of solutions for all. So it may be that recruitment is really the top issue in the large urban area in a state, and in a smaller community, it's really having the staff to do the training and evaluation afterwards. That's the problem.
Okay, thanks.
Commissioner Patrick?
If I could shift gears just slightly, and my apologies, Barry, for putting you on the spot here, but earlier this afternoon we had testimony regarding the ERIC project from David Becker and from Shane Hamlin, and they were speaking a lot about kind of the process and some of the efficiencies in list maintenance, but if I'm not mistaken, you've also done some work on some of the other outcomes from the election last year in relation to voter registration, turnout, impact on provisional ballot being cast, that sort of thing. And I was wondering if you could maybe just share with us some generalities, because I understand you don't have the presentation or anything in front of you, but if you could kind of share with the Commission some of the things that you found about the efficiencies of having good list maintenance processes as it turns out on Election Day, and some of those outcomes would be appreciated.
How much time do we have? So there are two parts to the ERIC project. I'm involved with evaluating both of those. The first part has already happened, and that's reaching out to eligible voters identified through DMVs through this matching process, with a postcard sent in each of the 7 states, about 5 million postcards. And so I've evaluated the effects of those, and you'll be seeing that in a report shortly in the coming weeks. But the story is positive, that you see higher numbers of voters registering in ERIC states than in non-ERIC states. You see fewer people reporting problems at the polls or confusion about registration deadlines. On a variety of metrics, there seems to be a positive impact. And that ought to help with cost and administrative difficulties in those states, because they now have smoothed that process. We're still in the midst of the second stage, which is the list maintenance activities. And so I've only heard snippets from the states about what's happening. The signs are also positive, but we'll find out later this fall exactly how that's worked.
Barry, just to go back to poll workers, we heard today and we've heard earlier the sort of, as you suggested, the other sort of repositories for recruitment of poll workers. I mean, you talked about college students, I guess, younger poll workers. One other one we've heard about is county employees, teachers in those places which have the in-service days. Are there any sort of, well, first question is, how frequently are county workers used, maybe mandated to serve as poll workers? Is that like a one-off type of phenomenon, or is that a pretty frequent occurrence?
In terms of mandating county or municipal workers, I don't know of a state that requires that. At least in the laws that the EAC has collected data on that we've tried to update, I don't see that in a state statute that says that has to happen. It may be happening informally. There may be pressure from managers in some state agencies or county agencies to encourage employees to do that. I don't know that it's required. It is one of the things that comes up in the laundry list of best practices, is to ask municipal or county employees to come in and work for the day, particularly younger employees. But I don't know other than that.
Sense of just the what jobs poll workers, those who are not retired, have besides when they're not poll workers? Is that something anyone's studying? No.
With that, thank you very much, Stephen Barry. Very informative for us. We will now take a short break, probably 10 minutes if we can, to reset the room, and then we'll begin the public testimony. Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to the public testimony session. We appreciate very much and have learned at our past hearings from the comments of all of you who want to come before us. There are many of you, so we will ask you to hold your comments to 3 minutes. We have a handy-dandy timing device. There are lights up here that you'll see. And when it starts flashing red, the 3 minutes is up, and we will be fairly rigorous in enforcing that. For sake of planning, let me read the order in which we'll ask people to come forward. If I leave anybody off, we'll certainly find room for you to testify. But Michael Stinciano, Keith Cunningham, Elaine Herrick, Jim Milliken, Emily Schuler, Matthew Talchak, Jan Kelly, Camille Wimbish, and then we have a number of people from Independent Voter who we'd like to come up together. If you can consolidate your remarks, we'd certainly approve that. Rick Roble, Mark Ritter, Jonathan Lippincott, Sadie Moore Stewart, and Mary Rook. Norman Wernett, Bentley Davis, Cotty Rizzuto, Carla Herron, Kermit Davis, Danielle Gray, Diana Morose, Jocelyn Bucaro, Philip Hasher, Carrie Davis, Cheryl Jansen, Cliff Arnbeck, Amy Searcy, Sherry Poland, Maury Siegel, Susan Holtzfagel, I may have pronounced that because I can't quite read the writing, and Lynn Kincaid, and Adele Eisner. So that will be the order we'll go in, if you could be aware of that and just be ready. So Michael Stiziano, if you're here. Off to an auspicious start. Keith Cunningham.
Yes, we are.
Hi, good afternoon. I'll be quick. One of the questions not asked following the 2000 election, I believe, was, my name's Keith Cunningham. I'm a recently retired Ohio election official. I'm not going to go into all of that and waste time about myself. So the question I believe not asked following the 2000 election was, why were boards of elections using punch cards anyway? It was outdated technology that was 80 years old, had been discarded by most people by the 90s. And while the funding for HAVA was greatly appreciated and the equipment was updated, we're kind of back in the same spot we were, where most counties are running outdated election equipment with 1990s software platforms. So and now the money is gone, and most jurisdictions are not going to be able to replace this equipment. So the first suggestion I'd like to make today is that the next generation of election equipment is going to require an expenditure of state, federal, and local dollars in unison in some type of a partnership. And I would propose that we get that formula together sooner than later so counties can begin. We have equipment available. Counties need to begin making these purchases. Otherwise, we're going to end up in another situation like 2004, 2005, where everything just got replaced en masse and it was chaotic. Most boards of elections, in my estimation, are geared at about a 40 to 45% turnout. When we throw another 30% on it and run it up to 70, we begin to stress the system. We have problems. There are additional costs. I believe there should be a system of federal chargebacks where locals charge cost above and beyond the normal operation of an election board back through the state to the federal government. I think that with something like that in place, local budget authorities are going to be more inclined to fund boards of elections and are not going to be faced with making decisions about service versus budget. 2 minutes isn't a lot of time, guys. I would also assert to you that the training that we currently have is too broad in general. We need to develop ideally online training that the states can administer. I'd like to think that the federal government might fund states in these type of projects, much like Michigan's doing. Georgia's eLearn. Boards of elections officials are dying and starving for information. And I think an investment in this type of knowledge-based system, as anybody in higher education knows, we no longer need to bring the student to the school. We can take the school to the student. Finally, I think it's time for it's time to stabilize the election environments. You've heard here today that it's been chaotic, and it has. We've got to quit moving the goalposts, constantly changing the laws. We need to get some standards in front of us. What is a long line? What is a good voter ID? You tell me what a long line is, I can manage to it and meet that goal. But I can't do it if it's a moving target. What is a reasonable identification provision? What is a logical and affordable, manageable time for early voting? So on and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you. We're happy to take any written submission you might have, too.
Yeah, let me emphasize that, as Co-Chair Ginsburg did. We do have on our website, and have had for some time, the opportunity for extensive remarks to be submitted, and I can assure you the Commission reads all of them. So this is an opportunity for you to give a sort of short introduction, but if there's more that you want to add, we have the mechanism to receive it, and we would encourage it. Thank you.
Elaine Herrick.
Thank you for allowing me to speak today. My name is Elaine Herrick. I serve as a member of the Greater Dayton League of Women Voters. I am the Military Vote Coordinator. In January of 2012, I became aware that an important source document used throughout the military to file their absentee ballot request form was wrong, and so I began a conversation with the Federal Voter Assistance Office on this issue that continued for 9 months until September of 2012, when it was corrected. You see, the address, the zip code, and the email for the Montgomery County Board of Elections was wrong. This source document is critical to the process of voting because all sources use this information to process an absentee ballot for the military. It is the source that each base voting officer uses. It is the reference that the military wife uses. It is the document all military members are sent to complete their application for an absentee ballot. When this information is wrong, we have to wonder how many requests to vote were lost and never received. I also ordered forms for voter registration and absentee ballots from the Federal Voter Assistance Office, as throughout 2012 I worked with a variety of groups, military moms in Brookville, Ohio, Blue Star Moms, Boy Scouts, local churches, and they all sent these registration forms and absentee ballot request forms in their care packages. Initially, I was able to receive 3,000 to 4,000 at a time. Suddenly that stopped. I was told I was not qualified to handle these documents. It would not receive any more. After many conversations, I was finally deemed qualified, and then I was told that the printed forms were not necessary. The military could process their requests online. Again, my request for forms was denied. Finally, I was told that the Paperwork Reduction Act had impacted this, and that I would be restricted to the number of forms I could receive based on the population of my county, and therefore no more than 1,000 forms would be allowed in my county in any month. Not having the forms to mail out in the care packages could have significantly impacted our results. However, the Ohio Secretary of State's office had produced a brochure that included not only the standard Form 76, but also answered many questions regarding voting. And because we were able to get that material, we were able to continue with our care package program. I believe we shipped out somewhere between 27 and 30,000 requests for absentee ballot requests to our military. Towards the end of the cycle, I realized that we had failed to support an entire group of people. Our civilian contractors serving overseas, no one is offering them any assistance, and many of them are our former military. So I'm asking for three things. I'm asking for you to address the Federal Voting Office and ask that the addresses and the emails be reviewed every year to make sure that they are, in fact, up to date. Am I over?
You are. If you could just give us the two other things real quickly.
The voter registration form should not be impacted by Paperwork Reduction Acts. The opportunity to vote should not be restricted. And third, that our overseas civilians, those companies that are hiring these people, if we could include in their contract their responsibility to get this the absentee ballot request forms to them, I think that might be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jim Milliken.
Thank you. My name is Jim Milliken. I'm currently a regional liaison for Secretary of State Husted, but prior to that I was a director, deputy director in Jackson County, Ohio. It has a population of about 33,000. Voter registration at the time of the 2012 general election was about 24,000. So I'm here today to speak not as a representative of the Secretary of State, but my experiences as an election official in a rural county in southeastern Ohio. Normally, there are two people working during the year, the director and the deputy director. During the election, if funds are available, 2 more part-time people will be added for about 6 weeks prior to the election to assist with absentee voting, both in office and mail-out ballots. They will prepare the election equipment for Election Day, conduct poll worker training, answer the numerous public records requests, and anything else that needs completed to have a successful election. Now, some counties do contract some of this preparation work, but others, like we did in Jackson County, did everything ourselves to save the county money. While larger counties may contract companies to deliver the voting equipment for Election Day, in some rural counties, board members do this. In other words, rural counties do what is necessary and put in the hours needed to make the election successful with the resources available and allocated. My concern is unfunded mandates that may arise out of suggestions in the form of laws or future equipment purchases. That being said, I do believe we have the technology available to make the voting process more accessible and easier for all people. For instance, electronic poll books. I'd also like to think before I die that I'd be able to vote online. And I think that would help UOCAVA and military voters, and I do believe it would increase voter participation among our younger generation that has grown up with this technology. In closing, I thank you, and I do wish you the very best in improving the election experience for all voters in all elections, including what is considered off-year elections, while being cognizant of the realities of elections in rural America, and particularly in rural Ohio. Thank you.
Emily Schuler.
Hello, my name is Emily Schuler, and I'm a communications major and sophomore at the University of Cincinnati. I wanted to thank the Presidential Commission on Election Administration for this opportunity to testify. Originally, I am from Hilliard, Ohio, but I am registered to vote at my off-campus address here in Cincinnati. This past November 6th, I had the extraordinary opportunity to cast a vote in my first presidential election. I was excited. However, leading up to Election Day, I heard horror stories, long lines, ID problems. I'd be forced to cast a provisional ballot, and more and more. Except on Election Day, I experienced none of these problems. My polling place was at a library right off campus, very close to me, and the lines there were extremely short. I got right through with no problems and voted. In fact, none of my friends who voted at their off-campus polling places had problems, and all had reasonable waiting times. I didn't even have to skip class to vote. As well, many of my friends from Columbus who go to UC were able to take advantage of Secretary John Husted's online voter address change system. This was a quick and easy way for them to change their address to their UC homes. So I wanted to thank Secretary Husted for running smooth elections for students, and I would encourage the Commission to adopt his reforms. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Matthew Tollett.
Thank you, co-chairs, and to you, fellow commissioners, to your fellow commissioners, for allowing this public testimony time. Like Mr. Lomax, I too am from Clark County, the one in Ohio, though, where we don't have a Caesar's Palace, but we are the home of 4-H. I currently serve the Clark County Board of Elections as its director, and with its deputy director and 4 full-time staff members, we serve approximately 87,000 voters, staffing 90 precincts and 63 polling locations, with around 400 poll workers being trained each full county election. Absentee voting in Ohio needs some help, and so does provisional voting, and I want to touch on those two topics today. While Ohio legislators in 2006 lifted the restrictions on absentee voting to no fault or no reason absentee voting, significant conflict has erupted over the past several years regarding this ability, and there's strong disagreement and tensions among the political parties as to what we should do with absentee voting. I can honestly say I'm not positive what we should do, but I do think we should listen to one valuable source of information coming from the mouths and the hearts of election officials who deal with this topic day in and day out. Absentee voting needs reconstruction, consistency, and rethinking in Ohio. Election officials worked as a bipartisan team to come up with suggestions that we would bring to the legislatures through our executive director as an association, and I hope that they will take these suggestions and implement them into our state law. Since a channel of American politics runs through Ohio, it would be difficult for some in this state to stomach the possibilities of introducing same-day registration. However, it would help the provisional problem that we are faced with each election. I don't think that will happen in Ohio, but I do believe reforms such as online voter registration and using the tools that we talked about today, such as the ERIC project and the Kansas State project, would help us to create a more accurate voter roll that would in turn help with the amount of provisional votes that we have. If we would simply utilize the time and energy that we use and expend after the election, before the election, to make our rolls as accurate as possible, and to possibly take our 30-day registration deadline and make it more like 14 days, and utilize the federal monies that are going to come as a result of the Presidential Commission to help states like Ohio introduce electronic poll books, we would be able to stop some of these problems that are occurring from election to election in Ohio. If my dream could come true, I would see some of those realities take place. But I do hope that people understand that Ohio is comprised of great election officials who work hard and are dedicated towards the goals of democracy. And I thank the Presidential Commission here today on election administration for your time.
Thank you. Jan Kelly.
Good afternoon and welcome to Cincinnati, and thank you for being here. My name is Jan Kelly and I am the new director at the Montgomery County Board of Elections. We serve, as of this afternoon, 372,000 registered voters in our county. One thing that we do that has put us on the front line of technology is we are a county-wide e-poll book county. What has helped with this is that we don't have long lines. We don't have the bottleneck that you usually have at the table because you can go to any line anytime. That's kind of a logo we kind of lifted from McDonald's. And it's worked out tremendously. The poll workers like it. The voters like it. One thing, I wasn't here for the whole seminar. We have one early vote center in the city of Dayton. Sometimes people will wait up to 2.5 hours to vote on those days. We move the people, mobilize them like Disney does through different floors. I never have heard a complaint from anybody that waited in line at the Board of Elections for 2.5 hours. But the complaints have come from areas where people did not have the chance to early vote because there weren't vote centers conveniently located throughout the other counties. So I think that the commission needs to look at serving not just one constituency, but all of our voters throughout our county and facilitate the early voting process in that manner. So we would need certainly we always need monies to implement these new ideas. Our machines, again, are about 8.5 years old. We're pirating pieces from other pieces of equipment, doing the best we can right now. But technology is the key to the future, and we try to stay on top of it as much as we can. The statewide voter registration database that the Secretary of State has done through Steve, which is the deceased rolls, and the Bureau of Motor Vehicles has been tremendous in helping us clean up our voter rolls and instilling, I think, a real sense of pride in our office as well as voter confidence. And that's something we strive for on a daily basis. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to admit moderator error in the calling of the list. Alicia Reese, please.
Good afternoon. I'm State Representative Alicia Reese. I want to welcome you to my district and to Cincinnati. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to testify on election administration. I come before you today as a member of the Ohio General Assembly representing the 33rd District, President of the Ohio Legislative Black Caucus, National Board Member of the National Action Network, and a concerned citizen on a crusade to make voting rights permanent in the Ohio Constitution and ultimately the Constitution of the United States. Last month, I had the distinct honor to serve as one of the keynote speakers at the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King, where I called for a voter Bill of Rights to be added to state constitutions around the nation. Although women gained the right to vote in 1920 and African Americans in 1965, Ohio and many other states have struggled over the years with voter suppression, intimidation, voter disenfranchisement, and thousands of uncounted ballots and lawsuits. Commissioner and Chairman, there is a great cause for concern when in Ohio there are almost 50,000 provisional ballot and absentee ballots that have been thrown out, an unknown number of votes that have not been counted by machines in November of 2012. In my own district in Hamilton County alone, 1,900 ballots in 2012 were not counted, and in 2010, it took 2 years for a judicial race to be decided because of uncounted votes. Ohioans have had to fight for their provisional ballots to be counted. Therefore, that's why I'm calling for today a voter Bill of Rights to not only be implemented in Ohio, but ultimately to be looked at in our Constitution that would focus on having a constitutional right to vote, identifying what early vote hours we'll be able to vote, and protect voters from any discriminatory practice like voter IDs. Today, I have a longer presentation, but I know we don't have a lot of time. But my message to you is please take back to Washington that we need voting rights in our Constitution so that it's not changed by the whim of any political party who happens to be in charge that particular year. Thank you.
We have 5 people in the audience from the independent voter movement, and if we could ask you to all come up together. We certainly have heard from your movement at our other hearings, and we appreciate your coming today. And if you're all endorsing each other and want to reduce the testimony, that would be great. Thank you.
My name is Rick Roble. As a member of the Electoral Reform Committee of our national organization, independentvoting.org, and our state organization, Independent Ohio, I'd like to speak to 3 questions. But first, I have 2 overall observations. First, on behalf of independents, we'd like to thank your staff and you for your public service in addressing barriers to casting ballots, such as long voting lines. We independents believe that your country also needs your service in addressing barriers to participating in elections and offices. As a second observation, I've been here since early this morning, and I've heard from a number of different panels. During the time I've been here, I've heard a lot about political parties and Republicans and Democrats, but I haven't heard a word about the rights of independents. So who are we? The independence movement is a civil rights movement of the 21st century. Mr. Chairman, as you've mentioned, you've already heard at various prior hearings about how 40% of Americans self-identify as independents. In fact, as indicated in Exhibit 1 to my written statement, here in Ohio, nearly 70% of voters are not affiliated with any political party. Present today are independents from the Midwest. We come in all shapes, sizes, and colors, all ages, genders, and backgrounds, and a rich diversity of viewpoints. But one core tie binds us together: our belief that our elected officials should be servant leaders to the American people who place loyalty to the people above loyalty to a political party, that meretricious partisanship is tearing our nation apart, and that our nation's founders were in the mark when they aspired to a democratic republic that respects diverse viewpoints, a system that judges ideas not based on the party or politician that proposes them, but on the reason and evidence that support them. As illustrated in Exhibit 2, throughout our nation's history, independents have been its conscience. Why are we here? We are here to petition for equal treatment under the law. In Ohio, independents are not permitted to vote in primary elections, even though they must pay taxes to support them. Though sometimes benignly called the party primary system, our nation's founders called it taxation without representation. Independents are not permitted to serve on the local boards of elections in Ohio by statute. Compounding this problem, gerrymandering aimed at preventing competitive elections and keeping the two-party monopoly of professional politicians in power is rife in the state of Ohio. You have as Exhibit 3 my own congressional district, which illustrates that. You'll hear from other independents the pernicious effects of these barriers to participation. Final question, what can you do? We ask that your final report recommend that the President permit you to build on your work in the future. Your next task should be to consider and make recommendations on systemic issues that limit participation in the democratic process by addressing barriers to participating in elections and offices. Thank you for your attention.
I'm the only one from Kentucky in the group, so I'll go ahead and speak. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. My name is Mark Ritter, and my residence is Frankfort, Kentucky. I appreciate the opportunity to speak before this commission in support of your charter to study and recommend improvements for election-related issues in our exceptional country. I am one of over 229,018 voters registered as other in Kentucky. Kentucky excludes independent voters like me or anyone registered as a third party to vote in the publicly funded primary election process. In 2009, I spoke before the Kentucky Elections and Intergovernmental Affairs Committee in support of the Kentucky House Bill 17, an amendment to KRS 116.055, qualification for voting in primary elections. I spoke of how this amendment would energize the electoral process and the fairness of access to the voting booth. Unfortunately, the bill did not reach the floor of the Kentucky House for a vote. However, the pressure to do the right thing was very apparent. The following year, Kentucky Senate Bill 53, allowing independents to vote in primaries, did make it to the Senate floor and was passed on February 2, 2010 with 25 yea votes and 12 nay. The bill failed in the Kentucky House vote. Why? Fear for change, fear for loss of control, fear that more informed voters would participate in our nation's coveted process to choose our leaders. The reality is that the two-party control of our electoral system is wrong. Extreme partisan politics is wrong. It does not serve the people and move our nation forward. Our current electoral process only perpetuates this loss of civility among our elected leaders that the Congress has become so ineffective it is unable to produce a federal budget, a most fundamental duty of government. Your charge to improve the electoral system can best be accomplished by allowing access of all registered voters to the primary elections. Our service members have defended this right to vote throughout our history. I have served in Iraq as an officer of the United States Army Reserve. I find it appalling that we continue to restrict access of registered voters not aligned with the Democrat and Republican parties. My recommendation is the committee consider access of the independent or non-aligned registered voter to the electoral primary process. We will then be truly exceptional. Thank you.